it can resolve questions like, is a thermostat an agent because it feels cold?
Can you drop any other that you think might be important here, and why would you believe that?
At a high level, one thing that I'll talk a little about, because we'll have something out relatively soon on it, is the idea of complexity at a high level. And so complexity is, I think, a very interesting feature. And we find many complex things innately attractive to us as biological creatures. And it's not just us. Animals do it, insects even to some extent um, do this. And so, but it's hard to explain why we might find beauty attractive. You could argue beauty is predictable because it follows some sort of symmetry, but we don't typically, at least I personally don't typically find a plain circle or a square particularly beautiful. um, and there still needs to be a level of complexity. And so there's this balance in my mind between complexity and the structure, the information structure behind that, and predictability, right? And then personally, I believe these are different biological drivers that interact in some very interesting ways that actually lead to far more complex behavior than a single driver alone.
Very interesting. I'm really interested in this at the moment because I've just had a few conversations with mathematicians that are modeling the shape of DMT experiences. So
Right.
I think a lot of what you just said there resonates with, as people take escalating doses of DMT, what they see is this greater complexification and symmetrical nature of their environment. You know, things go from threefold symmetries to fourfold, fivefold, sixfold, sevenfold. And it just, as these symmetries and levels of complexity expand, you know, people note experientially, phenomenologically, that this is a more intense experience, that it's more all encompassing. Do you think that there's some connection there? Is that a link that doesn't relate to your work, or does that sound related to what you just said?
I think that there's a relation there. Of course, bear in mind, like there's the work of Cortical Labs where we really are looking to provide a platform to people. But as a scientist, I have a particular interest in, uh, I guess, informational drivers of intelligence foundationally, what I like to sort of refer to as like the information physics. So I believe that there probably is a link there. And I think though there's plenty of examples. And in particular, I was inspired. I have a little 15-month-old now, but I was inspired because I've been working this idea of complexity for a while. And I saw her as her eyes began to develop around the first few months, and she just loved fractals. And I thought, why? Why? Like, why would she love fractals more
Yeah.
than the square or the circle? You'd show the circle, she'd look at it, look away, where's the nil? You'd show her some sort of fractal pattern. Oh, she would not look away. She loved the fractal pattern. So this sort of led to me saying, I can't explain this with the tools that I currently have. And I've been working on these other approaches for a while, but I've kind of been playing around this fuzzy edge of an idea. And it was upon seeing this that I really went, huh, there's actually something we can do with this. And again, with apologies for sort of dropping hints, we have been doing some explorations there. And I think some of the data is really interesting. And I think it really adds a new perspective on how we go forward with these things.
You would be a really fun guest to get on with a few of these people I've been speaking to. Like, are you familiar with the work of Andres Gomez Emelson? He's the research director at the Qualia Research Institute, and he's really putting mathematical formalizations that I don't remotely understand, I want to be clear about that, behind qualia, behind experience, behind consciousness. And it just seems, and it's very fractal in nature, and there just seems to be a lot of connections there with what you're speaking about. And he's done a lot of the really rigorous computation, and he's a brilliant guy. I think you guys
Yeah,
would have a
yeah.
fun conversation.
Well, I think it is interesting, and it does relate back, I think, also to these questions on ethics that we're talking about, because figuring out what experience, if any, these cells in a dish can have, and I will flag very clearly, there is no evidence that these cells in a dish can have an experience in any way we would remotely associate with that word. But there are many people who are still very, very worried. like without any evidence for it. I work with a lot of these people who do have these concerns, and I don't judge them for those concerns. But it is good to sort of, you can be concerned about the future, but like ground it in the present evidence. And the people I work with do that, and that's great. Uh, but one of the things we're doing to try and address the risk that could exist one day is to develop metrics like you're talking about. So we recently have a paper out at the moment, just as a preprint under review currently, but we expect it to be out soon, looking at agency. Agency is a big topical word at the
Mm,
moment with all the LLMs. And we
yes.
actually developed this mathematical framework. It doesn't prove something has agency, they can exclude things that don't based on how they process and transform information they receive.
Very
And so it's
cool.
quite a powerful tactic. And you could imagine extending that to things like consciousness or whatever term. I mean, the terms are very badly defined, as we said before, but you could extend this and start to put these uh, borders around things where you can say, look, we don't understand exactly what consciousness is, and maybe we never will. But at the very least, we can say, if you don't have this, we don't even need to worry about it. For example, if you can't transform the information you receive in a meaningful way, you almost certainly do not have agency because all you're doing is being a response, like a reflex to
Yes.
greater or lesser extent. And there's a few varieties of those, but it's a way to sort of say, hey, look, is a thermostat an agent? It changes when it feels cold. A thermostat isn't an agent, but it's very hard formally to say why that is. So we're
Yes.
putting these boundaries around it, and we hope to use that in our systems to also sort of identify anything that requires further look. So if people say, well, how do you know it's not conscious? We can say, well, we've done this analysis and it actually does not show the same metrics that a human does. Or we find out, like in some other cases, that metric is actually not related to consciousness at all. Like
Yes.
there's some work we did there on criticality, and we were able to really demonstrate that this is necessary, but not at all sufficient.
I find this so fascinating. I've had a bunch of conversations again around biological agency at different levels of self organization. Lots of guests on that are really confident that individual cells display information. And I guess the one piece of that you dropped there is that, can the system transform a signal from the environment to make it meaningful to itself is one of these, hallmarkers of agency. I've spoken to Philip Ball about this, who wrote a fantastic book called How Life Works, really looking at agency being the one of the most foundational pillars to think about biology. And he makes the argument, very hard to prove. Again, we don't have a framework, but it really seems like what individual cells are doing is display a level of problem solving agency. They explore their environments, they make meaningful use of ambiguous information. So I'm curious for you to dive into this. And I asked him this question, like what, because complex behavior can look like agency, right? And it's very hard to disentangle them. How do
Exactly.
you, how do you disentangle what's like truly an agent and what is doing something that looks complex? Like, bacteria and like chemotaxis is an example, right? They will follow chemical gradients. That kind of seems like agency, but then you could also see how that's not agency. And then the exact boundaries are always blurry. Boundaries don't really exist, but like talk about how we could develop that framework because I think this has huge implications for biology.
For sure, yeah, I fully agree with you. I should specify the work we've recently done doesn't actually allow you to prove something is an agent, but it does allow you to prove what isn't an agent, and that
Right.
as I said, that's helpful
Okay.
on its own.
That's a lot of progress.
Um,
That's more than a lot of guests have been able to say. So
it
yeah.
it's yeah, it at least that's our proposal. I mean, we think it's pretty well supported. It's received quite a bit of support from people who've seen it so far, but of course, science progresses one step at a time. Uh, So the short example of this in between with agency is we basically propose this three-layered frameworks, which we call information processing orders. And essentially the first order of information processing is effectively just a reflex. You pass some sort of threshold and then there's an action. But the actual information that's being transmitted, it remains basically the same that it is. It doesn't cause any complex change. All you have to do is reach a threshold and it passes. The second level that we have, the second order complexity, uh, actually has some sort of rudimentary um, transformation. So you might think of this as like you send something in and then it might double or triple, or it may change in some small way. But it's not actually creating any sort of meaningful qualitative compounded change over time, right? So it might have actually quite complex cycles, like a memristor in neuromorphics can actually have some fairly complex dynamics, but it doesn't actually physically change or meaningfully change the way the information is in a dynamic way. It doesn't have the real case of learning in any complex biological sense. This third order, though, does add this feature of actually qualitative memory over time, where the change that occurs can actually then change the information yet again. And so it can compound over time. And basically, observing this compound over time suggests that the system itself changes how it treats information that it will then receive over time. And I think that's the core of being an agent in the environment, being able to have not just a response to information, but for lack of a better word, agency over how you respond in that situation. And so the ability of these systems to monitor and change their change over time is really powerful, I think, as a defining feature. If you can't have that, we would argue you can't have agency. And it's kind of a simple, straightforward approach, but it's not one that people had adopted before and really gotten down to saying, what's the most fundamental need in terms of how you deal with information? And it's that
Yeah.
ability to change how you change over time.
So time frame sounds like the key dimension there in terms of moving down the order of agency. The first order of information processing is basically responding very immediately to something in the environment that doesn't really persist in, as you say, a dynamic way through time. It might change its state once, but it's not going to change its state again and again and again based on some sort of signal at one time. And then as you go second order, third order, it's basically sort of about the time frame that a system can maintain some sort of dynamic change based on something it responded to in the environment. Again, that's an even simpler way that even lacking in more nuance the way you described it. But is that maybe sort of the one dimensional simple way to think about it, that it's really about
I,
time frame?
yeah, I don't think it's not just about time frame. It's how the systems, and there's many layers of system, right? I think about like a synapse versus set cell versus a network of cells. So there's many systems here, right? And you might have a case where you have like the synapse probably doesn't have agency, right? Does a cell have agency? I don't know. We'd have to test it. Probably not, but we'd have to test. What about the network? Like at some level, you might see something emerge, but it's not at all levels. I'd say the core thing is not just time, it's actually how that change to the incoming information occurs over time. And if
Yes.
it can adapt in a specific way over time and actually transform that information in a specific, or in any way really over time, that then in itself changes, that is the most fundamental basis for agency. And again, it doesn't prove that just because your system does that, suddenly it has agency. There's a whole lot of other work that says, you need capacity, intentionality. People have looked at like counterfactualities. There's a lot there that still needs to come into place. But at the very least, it can resolve questions like, is a thermostat an agent because it feels cold? And I
Yes.
think like that, at least, this is actually how this all started, because a friend of mine would often argue sort of from a panpsychist perspective, everything's got some agency. And I'd say, no, it doesn't. Well, prove it. So fine. Here's an answer that I think addresses it. Um, yeah, sometimes science comes from sort of very deep, profound Promethean desires to seize fire, and other times from a argument with a friend.
A wager over a few beers. Yeah, I relate. As an Irishman, I definitely relate to that. But
Yeah.
I'm kind of interested to hear that you would lean towards a cell not having agency. Of course, being a good scientist, we can't say one way or the other. But again, depends on definitions. But based on what you described there, I'm like tick tick tick, like a cell. I think a cell
But a
absolutely displays
cell,
that.
yeah, it may. But the nice thing is we don't have to query it, right? Like with uncertainty, we can just set out and test it, and we'll get an answer that will say yes or no. And that's the nice thing about what we put forward again, is that this isn't just a sort of, castle in the sky idea. It's one that we can rigorously test and answer and say, how does that fit in the framework? One of my frustrations, I'm not in academia anymore, but one of my frustrations with a lot of the work that's coming out of the scientific community is a preference to be vague instead of wrong. And I
Right.
think that this is, and I was actually amused to find Freeman Dyson, famous for Dyson spheres and not the vacuum company. I think they took his name, but Freeman Dyson, uh, who was obviously a famous scientist, proposed. Maybe you should edit that out. I don't know if they took his name or if they've got another Dyson. I might get sued for that. Retracted. um, but he actually said the same thing all the way back in his day as well. Is that like this? The biggest detriment to science is that there's an unwillingness to be prepared to put down your ideas and be wrong. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm wrong all the time. I say, hey, I think the cells will do this. We test it. Cells don't do that. Okay. We know more than we did. We tried a new cell type recently introduced into our cultures. It seems like they've all collapsed. Not great for us, but we didn't think that would happen. We've learned something.
Yeah.
That's powerful. It's excellent to be wrong. Scientists should be rewarded for being wrong and writing it down, because the next time you might get it right. But if you always just only want to be vague, okay, well done. You're not wrong, but have you really helped us progress? Unfortunately, the incentives just aren't there anymore. This leads to a whole nother discussion, but the incentives in most scientific academic environments just aren't there to be
Yeah.
prepared to take the big swing and potentially be wrong. And so you get more and more iterative work building upon something that already exists, rather than people trying to create something that has never been before.
Yes, I was really going to say that's not a dig at the scientists, but that is a symptom of the infrastructure and incentives that we have. If you have
Of
a
course.
series of
Yeah.
two or three hypotheses that you were wrong on, that fourth grant proposal seriously becomes a lot harder to fund. But in the
Yeah.
private sector, when you have a much larger mission and more funding, you're able to take bigger swings. You're not relying on, these cycle of grant reports that really are relying on the last one. Of course, you have to
Exactly.
also do successful things and do meaningful things and have, do things that are valuable, but you get a little bit more or a lot more leeway to take big swings, be wrong. Yeah.
But it should be the other way around. I mean, our public funded science, and I know, yeah, again, pretty much all the scientists I've talked to would love the opportunity to take those big swings. These are, for the most part, creative, inspiring individuals who just want to go out there and try and do something, but they have to do the grant. And in Australia, grants are successful at the moment 7% of the time. It's gotten less than 10%.
Wow.
And so people just can't take that big risk. And it's
Yes.
such a pity. I mean, we can go really off track with this because I feel quite passionate about it. And I see so much wasted potential from amazing people who are just stuck in an environment that they don't have any other option. But
Yes.
we could do so much more across the world if only we could just fund science a little more and a little more ambitiously.
I
As
couldn't
is,
agree more.
I'm incredibly grateful to be uh, have Cortical Labs and have the funders and investors we have, who literally look at the world and, you know, don't just see it the way it is, but ask, how could it be? And are prepared to back us in our vision to try and create something. Uh, I'm a little relieved that we keep finding nice results, though,
Yes.
because we just don't know a lot of the time. Like, they are just questions. We never knew if the free energy principle would work. We tried to set up the experiment in such a way that if we found evidence against it, it would have been an interesting story as well. But um, it obviously wouldn't have been as interesting a story to find scientists show this doesn't work. But every step of the way, there's questions and uncertainty.
Yeah.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel